Hi everyone, my name is Franco. I'm a librarian with the Toledo-Lucas County Public Library, and I'm joined today with Abby, my colleague at the Oregon Branch Library. We're here today to talk about 90 years of Nancy Drew. 2020 is the 90th anniversary of the female detective, and we have some great panelists to talk about the history and the pop culture phenomenon and everything Nancy Drew. Just to get started, I'll go over some of their bios so you know who is talking today. We have Dr. Nancy Down, who is head of the Brown Popular Culture Library at Bowling Green State University. She has worked at BGSU libraries for 30 years and holds a Master of Library Science from Indiana University and a PhD in English Literature from Drew University. Dr. Down has given presentations on numerous pop culture topics, including fanzines, fandom collections, three-dimensional objects and archives, and gender and popular culture collections. She's a fan of mystery novels and detective television shows. Nancy, if you want to say hello real quick.
Hi.
All right.
I'm really happy to be here.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Down. We also have Jennifer Fisher. She is a Nancy Drew consultant and author. Her book, Clues for Real Life, The Classic Wit of Wisdom of Nancy Drew, was published in 2007, and she's currently writing a biography on Mildred Wirt Benson, the first Carolyn Keane to write the Nancy Drew series. Jennifer is president of the Nancy Drew fan group and the Nancy Drew Sleuths. She recently donated her Nancy Drew collection to the Toledo-Lucas County Public Library, and you can visit that at the Children's Library downtown at Main Library. You can learn more at her website, nancydrewsleuth.com, and about the Nancy Drew Sleuths fan group and conventions at nancydrewfans.com or ndsleuths.com. And Jennifer, if you want to say hello.
Hi, everybody. I'm happy to be here and hope you guys enjoy this fun panel. I mean, 90 years, right? That's pretty amazing.
It's a long time that brought us here.
Yes.
And then we also have Julie Rubini. Julie writes stories about incredible women and intriguing subjects for young readers. Her newest work is Psychology, Why We Smile, Strive, and Sing, which helps teenagers understand the science behind their behavior. Her other work includes Eye to Eye, sports journalist Christine Brennan, Missing Millie Benson, The Secret Case of the Nancy Drew Ghostwriter and Journalist, and Virginia Hamilton, America's Storyteller, which received a Kirkus starred review and is listed on Bank Street College of Education's Best Children's Books. Julie and her husband, Brad, established Claire's Day, a children's book festival in honor of their daughter. And you can learn more at julierubini.com or clairesday.org to learn more. Julian, if you want to say hello.
Hi, everybody. Great to be here. So look forward to our conversations.
Yep. And thanks to everyone for joining us today. We are recording the program, so this will be available for viewing later. If you do have any questions, feel free to drop them into the Q&A. Abby and I will monitor those throughout the program, and we'll have some time for Q&A at the end as well. But Abby, if you want to go ahead and kick us off with some questions for the panel.
Sure. So we're going to start with some personal background questions. Dr. Down, I'm going to start with you. And we're curious, what prompted your interest in Nancy Drew?
Well, I had been thinking about this and thinking about the first time I had read Nancy Drew. And it occurred to me when I was in junior high, in algebra class, we used to have these desks where you left your books and then you would exchange classrooms. So when you go into a class, you'd be sitting at someone's desk. And I was never really interested in math. So I just opened their desk one day and discovered they had like Hardy Boy and Nancy Drew books. So I started reading them during algebra class, which is probably why I'm so bad at math today, because I found reading the Nancy Drew more interesting. But that's the first time I can remember actually reading Nancy Drew. And having read them there, then I went and got my parents to take me to the library and get more of them to read.
That's a great answer. I love that. Julie, same question.
Well, you'll love this because it was a librarian in a bookmobile that turned me on to Nancy Drew. I grew up in the country, rode my bike up to the bookmobile, always filling up my little basket with as many books as I could. And once I discovered Nancy Drew, there was no turning back. So it was always a hope, and would encourage, the bookmobile to have the collections available so I could check some out. So that's how I fell in love with Nancy Drew.
Perfect. I love that. Jennifer, what about you?
So like Julie, it's a little bit the same. I had our school library had a lot of the library bound editions. And so kind of like she was saying earlier, like I would be in the library for a school program, but I would sit by the Nancy Drew books and I'm supposed to be, learning about other things, but I'm sitting there peeking in the Nancy Drew books. I just loved them. And so I checked them out there, and my mom would take me on trips to the bookstore, and, we'd get books. And so I just fell in love with the mysteries, but also the character, just so bold and spunky. And I loved it.
I remember checking them out too from the library, in particular the tiny paperbacks, the Nancy Drew diaries. I think they were for a younger audience. I remember checking those out. Dr. Down, as you said, you were introduced by a random classmate. Was there anyone else who recommended the series to you, or was there anyone that helped you find your interest in Nancy Drew, or is it just finding the books randomly in your desk?
I think finding them in my desk, and for some reason then I've always been attracted to the mystery genre, so then I've started reading throughout my life lots of mystery books, but I think like Nancy Drew was sort of like a gateway to the genre for me, because whatever attracted me to mysteries, then from there I started reading a lot in different subgenres, cozies, historics and that. So so I just think it was something about mysteries that appealed to me, and Nancy Drew was what opened my interest to the whole genre.
Yeah, there's so many subgenres in mysteries. I think it can easy to get caught into one area without realizing how much else there is out there. Julie, do you read other mystery series? Are there other series that you're interested in?
I'm that nonfiction writer, so I read a lot of nonfiction, but when I read fiction, I still enjoy reading mysteries. It was fun looking back at my bio of Millie and recalling a conversation I had with Kate White, the great, the New York Times bestselling author, and the influence, she's quoted the influence that Nancy Drew had in her and attracting her to mysteries and ultimately encouraging her to write mysteries. So, but I've loved, when I was younger, Edgar Allan Poe. I think Nancy Drew kind of just opened up the world of that genre and fell in love with mystery. So every now and then, I'll pick up a mystery.
What about you, Jennifer?
So for me, I just love Nancy Drew. Are there other mystery detectives out there? I'm just kidding. She was my favorite, but I read other books. They just didn't quite hold the same feel for me as Nancy Drew. And as an adult, I still read quite a bit of Nancy Drew for my research and my writing and planning those conventions where I've got to figure out a theme party or something. So I've got to go back through the books, but I read just kind of an average, assortment of, from like Sarah Paretsky to even vintage Agatha Christie. I love stuff like that too. I just find I don't have as much time to read the last few years as I would like because I'm so busy with projects. But yeah, I think like for a lot of kids, Nancy kind of was that gateway to reading. She hooked kids, and that was what was so great about it. Even though way back in the past, some librarians didn't think that was good literature. But if she's hooking you to read and then you're reading other things, that's a good thing. And I think that was kind of the same for me. I started with Nancy and branched out, but I always come back to Nancy. So
Abby, there's a question in the Q&A that I think might be pertinent right now. Is someone's asking if any of the panelists have read the Hardy Boys in tandem with Nancy Drew because of the direct correlations between them. I'll say that's certainly my introduction because these books, tend to be gendered, I think, for children. That Hardy Boys is kind of the entry point for boys and Nancy Drew for girls. But I'd be interested to hear what any of the panelists have to say.
I had 4 brothers, so Hardy Boys definitely made it into my reading as well. And the Bobley twins too. And it was so fun then doing the research for the book to learn that they were all created by Edward Stratemeyer. And so yes, I had now in tandem, I'm sure kind of interchangeably, but I think that's a great question to see whether, doing comparative between Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew. Yep.
Well, when I was growing up, I was more of a Nancy Drew fan than Hardy Boys. I had a friend that read both series together, and she and I would talk about it. I guess like he was saying about they're kind of gendered, I tended to stick to girls series or girls books. But as an adult, I've kind of checked out the Hardy Boys a little more. My dad used to read those as a kid. So I kind of started recollecting him Hardy Boys books a few years ago when Applewood Books was still reprinting the originals. And so I would peruse those. And then when I got to be on the Today Show for Al Roker's book club for kids, they were reading the first Nancy Drew and the first Hardy Boys book. And I had never read the first Hardy Boys book. So I went back and read that again, along with Old Clock. And that was interesting to see, you know, how there were the differences on those first books. I always joke, it took 2 Hardy Boys to solve a case, but it only took 1 Nancy Drew. I tease the Hardy Boys fans, but, you know, they're all good.
Dr. Down, did you read Hardy Boys at all or in tandem with Nancy Drew?
I had a younger brother, so I did read some of the Hardy Boys, but I think perhaps, you know, maybe because of being a girl, that it was more reading Nancy Drew. It's like you wanted to be like Nancy Drew, and the Hardy Boys didn't have that same feeling to it growing up. So it's like Nancy Drew was someone I could look at and like is the ideal girl that you think, well, that's what I want to be like, or, you know, you emulate. But the Hardy Boys are different, but they just didn't have that same appeal.
That's certainly understandable. And I would say the same, being a young boy and reading Hardy Boys. I read some Nancy Drew books, but it certainly didn't have the same appeal as the others.
Yeah, I don't think I ever read a Hardy Boys book, but I definitely read quite a bit of Nancy Drew. I think it goes both ways. Another question, how have the stories shaped you? How have they changed your view of yourself, or how you read, or how you view the world? Dr. Down, do you want to start?
I think looking back, reading Nancy Drew and why mysteries have always been kind of appealing to me is the view of the world that at the order is restored at the end of mystery. So no matter what happens during the book, and you find the guilty people, you solve the crime, and you end up with the world being kind of restored to a sense of order, and whatever injustice has been done is righted, and people can go on, you know, with their life to the next mystery. And I think for some reason that really appeals to me as a way to look at life. And I think maybe especially growing up, because my family wasn't was a bit chaotic. So it was a sense of security to have that feel of the world for me. So I found that kind of, looking back, maybe one of the reasons why I liked reading Nancy Drew and mysteries like that, because it gave you a more sense that maybe your world wasn't like this, but it was like the ideal, what it would be nice to have. And reading's always been like that it's a way of finding comfort in your life, as well as exposing you to new ideas and seeing things from different viewpoints. And so I think, you know, that it shaped my views in a lot. And I guess it's just my love of reading, because they're really good stories. So you get caught up in the plot, and you feel like you're there with Nancy Drew, kind of going along and seeing how you solve the cases. So just that sense of being on an adventure, and I think is what then I've looked for in reading for a large extent too, in leisure reading.
Absolutely. I agree with you on that for sure. Julie, same question. How has the Nancy Drew story shaped you?
I think as a young girl, to discover someone who was also independent and smart, and wanted to solve things really on her own, and just embrace, to know that it was okay to be all of those things. Again, the influence of my 4 brothers, and I had one tough sister, so we were all very much that way, raised to be independent and to rely upon our own resources. And so it was very validating as a child to have this character who was very successful in solving these mysteries, and at times irreverent and would do things that, 16-year-olds shouldn't necessarily do at the start of the series. But it was, again, very validating. It made me feel that it was okay to be the way that I was. And so, yeah.
What about you, Jennifer?
Yeah, so I think Nancy certainly shaped my life. I mean, I never would have thought reading these books as a kid, I'd be doing what I'm doing now. But, I definitely shaped my desire to go into law and that kind of avenue. And then this, of course, it shaped my curiosity. I mean, Nancy was a skeptic. She didn't believe in ghosts. And I'm always questioning and curious about things. In fact, like my boyfriend's always like, okay, listen, Nancy Drew, when I'm like trying to get to the bottom of something, I'm like, listen, I read Nancy Drew books my entire life. I've got that one up on you on that. So, it's like Julie was saying. I mean, these books inspired so many different kids. She was an amazing character. She could do anything she wanted, and she would help people and right wrongs, and all those little messages like that, resonate with kids. And I mean, the women on our Supreme Court have cited Nancy Drew as an influence. That's pretty amazing. She's touched all different walks of life and so many generations. I think that's pretty amazing. Funny things, that you could say she shaped my life. I mean, I learned if I'm ever in a plane, kidnapped in the middle of the sky, I can use a lipstick pen and write SOS on the window, and hopefully somebody will come along and see it, right? So there's all those funny little things, from the books. As an adult, you're like, no, I don't think there's a lot of traffic up there, but if you're Nancy Drew, there's going to be somebody to help you out. So
That's perfect. I love that. Let's move on to more of the history of the series. We've had some participants chime in with some questions similar to ours about all the different revisions and additions to the Nancy Drew universe. How have the modern interpretations, how have they added or even detracted from the original stories? Let's go ahead. Dr. Down, do you want to go ahead and start?
Well, I haven't read a lot of the more modern interpretations, but I work in a library that has a large romance collection. So two of the adaptations I thought were interesting are there's like a Nancy Drew in college on campus. And it just seems like from reading reviews of it, when you start introducing like modern problems into Nancy Drew, like drug use and, just different things that would really be happening on campus, that they don't seem as successful for readers. And so I just find it's interesting. What is it about Nancy Drew maybe that too much reality doesn't make it as successful reading for a lot of people? And there is another Nancy Drew adaptation that is almost more like a romance angle to it. And I think that is kind of interesting, where she and Ned kind of go back and forth about their relationship. And one of my interests has always been, when you take genres and try to combine them together, can you do that successfully? So can you have like mystery and romance and make it successful? And I don't know, it doesn't seem from like what readers say about different series that you can always with Nancy Drew.
All right. What about you, Julie?
I think this is a great question for Jen, because Jen is certainly much more of an expert as far as Nancy Drew. I would consider myself more of a Millie Benson expert, with having, certainly in there, Millie's story is so much a part of the Nancy Drew story and vice versa. But I will speak to the history, knowing that when the books were revised, Harriet Stratemeyer was involved, and that was very difficult for Millie, and it was difficult for Millie later in life. I know Jen and I had talked about this when we met, about how fans of Nancy Drew and fans of Millie would bring in revised versions of the Nancy Drews, which Millie really didn't have anything to do with, and didn't want to have anything to do with as far as signing them. She would really try and kind of preface it when someone would want to come to the plate and have her sign a book to make sure it was one of the originals, and one of the originals that she wrote, the 23 of the first 30 Nancy Drew. So, and things, there was a quote in my book about how the character changed slightly from the original to the revised versions once Harriet revised them in 50. So again, I defer to Jen. I think she could answer that question very thoroughly.
So yeah, modern Nancy Drew is such a paradox in a way, because she's had such a legion of fans, you know, since 1930. And when you go back to the beginning and then you look at today, it's just, obviously everything looks different. We dress differently, we act differently in some ways. But as long as I found when they modernize things, that as long as they keep the essence of the character of Nancy Drew, which is what fans love, you know, her boldness, her independence, her desire to solve a mystery at no cost, no matter what happens to her, and those kinds of things. As long as you keep the character fairly well like herself, as she's always been, then they're more successful. But when you bring in things like the romance, or when they sent Nancy off to college in the on-campus series, that didn't work out too well, because they were more about college angst and social issues than a mystery. And I think her legions of fans want to see a mystery. They don't want, like the movie in 2007 was a lot about mean girls and stuff and other themes, and kind of a parody of Nancy and her abilities. And fans didn't really gravitate towards that, a lot of them. And at the same time, when you're modernizing Nancy Drew, you have new fans, like little girls today, who are wanting to read these books. So how do you keep her relevant for today's generation? And they've somewhat successfully done that overall, you know, trying to hook the new readers, but yet keep the older readers. They still reprint the classic books, which is nice, because I know a lot of moms and grandmas still pass down those classic Nancy Drew books. Those are probably hands down the most popular through all these years, are those classic first 56 books that most people remember and, you know, and know. I think some of the modern incarnations, like there's the CW TV show, and it's either hit or miss with fans. I found they either love it or they hate it. It has elements of classic Nancy, and then definitely is modern. So it's kind of like, one of our members of our group kind of calls it alternate universes. They have a lot of that in the comic book world. He's a big comic fan. Shout out to Todd if he's here. But he kind of compartmentalizes it into different universes. So he has classic Nancy, and he has this Nancy, and then he's got modern Nancy and comic book Nancy. And he can kind of jump from either one and be okay with it. Some fans, it's like, if it's anything past book number 56, they are not going to read it. They're not going to support it. They don't like it. It's just not their Nancy. But I think we have to remember that if we want this series to be around in another 90 years, let's say, we have to try to keep her fresh and relevant for modern generations. But it is hard to do. I think people who try to do it, they either go off in some weird artistic license that doesn't resonate, or they try to stick with kind of book Nancy and keep her the same type of character she's always been. So those tend to be more successful adaptations, but it is a struggle, especially on TV and in movies, to keep Nancy fresh. I think the CW is doing a fairly good job, even with all the differences, because there are a lot of differences, like real ghosts. There were no real ghosts in the books. So some people have a hard time getting past that. It's just interesting how many different fans and types of people you know that respond to this, and how their takes can be, you know, whether they like everything or they have their little peculiarities, which is kind of fun. So yeah.
With all the adaptations and the spin-offs, I know Abby mentioned the Nancy Drew Notebooks series that she read as a kid. Do any of you have a favorite spin-off, or even someone in the QA asked if any of you have a particular favorite Nancy Drew book, and maybe why it's your favorite? And I'll let any of you answer who want to chime in.
Well, my classic books are obviously my favorite. Spin-offs, I would probably say the Nancy Drew Files have some nostalgia for me, because they came out in the 80s, and I was in middle school and high school at the time, and they were kind of for my age group. And they involved a little more romance, obviously, than the classics, but they also had murders. Ooh, they didn't do that in the classic books. So they were a little more sophisticated. And I thought that was kind of cool. I actually liked the File series. So that's my favorite of the spinoffs.
All right. Julie or Nancy, do you have a favorite spinoff, or even just a favorite Nancy Drew book?
I would say the originals I enjoyed, and it was great to revisit them in doing the research for the book on Millie. So I just, hands down, for me, I'm still an original Nancy Drew fan.
Yeah, I would say for me, the originals. In the 80s, I was in graduate school, so I was probably not doing any literature reading. So But I think the first three, because I think that kind of sets up the whole series and the character.
Excellent. Since we're talking about the original series, you know, Nancy was 16, I believe, in the original series, and then aged later to 18. I guess why? Do you have any thoughts on as to why give her that 2-year jump in age? Jennifer, if you want to start with that.
Yeah, so the reason is in all states they needed to age her for driving laws, so that she could be, you know, certain states you had to be a little older to drive, so they wanted to equalize all that. So that's the main reason they aged her to 18. So yeah. And of course, you know, with all her driving mishaps, you know, and the insurance problems her dad probably faced. But yeah, that's the main reason. So.
Right. Someone else is asking, going back to adaptations and spinoffs, if anyone has any thoughts about the video game series of Nancy Drew.
Do you guys want me to tackle this one?
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, so I like the video games. I think it was really awesome that her Interactive opened up the door to girl gaming like that. And really, they've been very successful. They've won lots of awards. I know in the last few years, they've struggled to update their platform and then came out with a new game after a several-year absence where they had to spend a lot of time to work on that. But they have a huge legion of fans. In fact, the actress playing Nancy Drew in the CW show came into Nancy Drew kind of as a gamer. She played the games. So there's a whole contingent of Nancy Drew game fans that are really hardcore into the games and then kind of got introduced to the books through the games. Some of them read the books and then found the games, but there's a lot of them who get introduced to Nancy Drew through the games. And one thing the games do, which is really successful, is you don't see Nancy Drew, you're like Nancy. So there's not this, anybody can be Nancy that way. There's no, like a book cover has a picture of her and it has a certain look, but with the games, like anybody can be Nancy Drew. And I think that's pretty brilliant of them to do it that way.
And I think too, it's as you've offered earlier, Jen, it's keeping it relevant for today's audiences. So you might be introduced to Nancy Drew through the video game and then get hooked into reading the series or vice versa. But it's really all about keeping Nancy Drew fresh and relevant for today's audiences.
Yeah.
Awesome. And it's been 90 years, and Carolyn Keane is still listed as the author. You know, what's that significance? Why keep Carolyn Keane? Why not, you know, give any due credit, at least in the main book series, on for the actual authors who are writing them?
Well, the main reason I think in the beginning, you know, that was Edward Stratemeyer's business model, was to have ghostwriters who would write under these pen names. And if they wanted to switch ghostwriters, they wouldn't have to change the pen name. So they could keep that kind of continuity. And it added a little bit of secrecy and mysteriousness to the whole thing of who is this mysterious Carolyn Keane, you know, until later down the road, people started talking about it and outing who was really writing these books. And then you knew who Carolyn Keane was, or who the several Carolyn Keanes were. But it was kind of just his business model of just keeping everything continuous.
And it wasn't until my book starts in 1980, which was the 50th anniversary of Nancy Drew, and Harriet Stratemeyer was quoted as saying that she had written the books. And of course, the trial involved who really had the rights. Stratemeyer had, under Harriet, had switched to Simon & Schuster as being publishers. Grasset and Dumlett had been publishers for all years previous. So there was ultimately the lawsuit, and as part of that lawsuit, trying to determine who had the rights, who had actually written it. And I love the story of how Millie Benson coming into the courtroom, and Harriet Stratemeyer, upon seeing her, said, "I thought you were dead." I mean, she really thought, oh, here it is, you know, and my goodness, I mean, I really tried to walk the line that, you know, if it were not for Harriet and Edna Stratemeyer and Millie Benson, Nancy Drew probably still wouldn't be in existence today. The plot twist here is that Edward Stratemeyer, after creating the outlines and having the first three that Breeder set published in 1930, he died, 12 days after they were first published, and there was no succession plan. The daughters, we're in the Depression. We're in the thick of the Depression. And so the daughters attempted to sell and were not successful. And thank goodness they took, the bull by the horns, and they reached out to Millie to continue to write the series and Grosset and Dunlap. It is miraculous that Nancy Drew survived all that they went through, given what the situation was. So, Edward was a genius. It was amazing when I was doing my research at the New York Public Library to see that there was an exhibit on children's literature. Just coincidentally, while I was there back in 2013, and to see that Edward, there was a letter to Millie that was flagged from the files and it was on display. And so Edward had his, and Nancy Drew had their own separate kind of display and exhibition signifying the significance of Edward and Nancy Drew, and of course Millie Benson as being a part of that. So
yeah, before we get to Millie Benson and the obvious Toledo connection, Elaine asked, I think, an interesting question in the Q&A that might be a cool bit of trivia, if there is any answer. And that is there any reason to why the name Carolyn Keane was chosen, or was that just something randomly put on the series?
As far as I've seen from the files in the New York Public Library, that it's just sort of one of those random things. I mean, they would come and they would suggest names to the publisher for the series, for instance, or that come up with a name like that. I mean, they had other ways of doing it, but there's not really like a letter that explains how they came up with it. I'm guessing Keane because, the name is kind of Keane. She's sort of a keen detective, maybe, was why they liked Keane, possibly. But I do know that Nancy could have been named Stella Strong. That was one of the suggestions for her name, but Nan Drew was another one, and then it linked into Nancy Drew. But yeah, we could be talking about the Stella Strong series here today.
It doesn't quite have the ring to it. It's alliterative,
no,
but I don't know.
It sounds more like Rosie the Riveter to me. I don't know. It gives me like a Rosie the Riveter feel for some reason. But
all right. Well, Abby, do you want to get into some of the questions in regards to our Toledo connections with Nancy Drew?
Yes, absolutely. There's been quite a few questions as well, specifically about Millie Benson and her impact on the series, and even the quality of her writing compared to the other ghostwriters that were used in the original books. Julie, do you want to go ahead?
Well, it's such a great story as to how Millie became that original ghostwriter. Millie is originally from a little town called Medora, Iowa. They're very proud of Millie there. Millie, her father was the town doctor, mom assisted, so Millie had a lot of free time to explore her creativity. And from a very early age, she wanted to be a writer. And she was first published when she was 13 in St. Nicholas magazine. And so her father, although he had kind of hoped she would follow in his footsteps, she chose the path of writing, went on to the University of Iowa, became the first person, male or female, to receive her Master of Arts degree from the University of Iowa School of Journalism. And, throughout some twists and turns in her life, ultimately, she responded to an ad that Edward Stratemeyer had posted looking for writers for books for boys and girls. And although she had not yet written as such, she wrote to them. And his assistant responded and said, well, we're really looking for books for boys and girls, but if you want to get back in touch with us, if you think that you can do this. And ultimately, she started writing for the Stratemeyer Syndicate several years before Nancy Drew. For another series, and Edward liked her style of writing and ultimately reached out to her to write the first Nancy Drew mystery stories. And it's interesting, her quote as far as feeling that Edward was, the character of Nancy wasn't quite what he envisioned to some degree, but the publisher really loved Millie's fleshing out of this character that Edward did create. Edward created the outlines, he created the storylines, he created the characters, but it was really up to Millie, being that original ghostwriter, to flesh out this character. And ultimately, Millie being that spunky, feisty, independent woman that she was, inserted a lot of herself into the original Nancy Drew and carries on today, and those standard kind of characteristics of the Nancy Drew characters in the various other series. And so then Millie lived in Iowa, married Asa Wirtz, her first husband, who was 19 years her senior. He was a teletype operator for Associated Press. He was ultimately transferred to Cleveland, and she began writing the Nancy Drew stories in Cleveland, and then ultimately he was transferred to Toledo. And so then she continued to write while she was in Toledo. Asa ultimately suffered a series of strokes in the 40s, and he passed. And then she married George Benson, who was an editor with the Toledo Times, and had her daughter Peggy by her husband Asa, and lived on Middlesex here in Toledo. The rest of her life, worked for the Blade for over 50 years. So that's a very quick version of Millie's kind of life and role in being that original ghostwriter for Nancy Drew.
Thank you, Julie. A more specific question about Millie, and anyone can answer this, is how did she feel about the Benita Granville version of Nancy Drew?
That's an interesting question that I've been kind of trying to track down for my biography of her. She was a little bit duped into signing away her rights for the movies, because when she originally wrote the first few Nancy Drew books, the releases did not waive movie rights or anything like that. It was all related to the books. So when the movies came up, they had a little situation that they needed to have her sign away her rights. And basically they used her signature as a ruse, from what I gather, allegedly, but they wrote to her and said, oh, your signatures look so different on all these releases. We're going to send you this new release, and you need to sign it, so we'll have a cohesive signature for all of these releases, yada, yada. So she does this, and then soon after she finds out there's movies coming out about Nancy Drew. So that was interesting. So I've been looking into that a little bit for the biography, so that's going to be interesting to talk about. Fast forward to the 70s, when we have television now happening. That release that signed away movie rights didn't deal with television exactly. So, so she was curious about her television rights and kind of inquired a little bit, but did it in kind of a strange way. And it ended up that lawyers for the syndicate sent her a very, very nice letter about, ceasing and desisting, talking about having written these books and on and on and on and on like that. As far as what she thought about the books, there is a letter in the New York Public Library where she mentions to Harriet, when they're corresponding about the books, that she went and saw one of the shows. She didn't really say anything specific. So I don't know exactly what she thought of them. Benita Granville was such more of a ditzy kind of version of Nancy Drew, a little more, she'd use her feminine wiles to try to get things done. Or, Ted instead of Ned was like the butt of her jokes. Basically, he was like her straight man. And so, there was all this kind of comedy going on at the same time. I like them, though. I think they're funny. I think they're charming. It's neat to see Nancy as she might have looked at that time period, in a film version. But yeah. So there you go. There's an interesting tidbit.
Another question about the different ghostwriters is, apart from Mildred Benson, did any other ghostwriters go on to become successful and famous authors of other books? If anyone knows, feel free to chime in.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that just one more time?
Yeah, did any of the ghostwriters, apart from Millie, go on to become successful and famous authors of other books?
Well, Walter Carrick, who wrote 3 Nancy Drew books during the Depression when Millie took a break because she didn't want to take a pay cut, he wrote some books on his own. One of them was called Zots, and some other ones. In fact, that led to kind of a publicity nightmare because his publicity agent outed him as being Carolyn Keane. And Harriet, it didn't sit well with Harriet at the syndicate to have this, dour Navy man revealed to be Carolyn Keane. So, you know, but yeah, he went on to do some books. I wouldn't say he wrote a lot of books. Harriet didn't really write her own. She just wrote the books for the syndicate. So there are some successful ghostwriters, I think, that have written paperback books. Of course, we don't know who all of those people were that went on to have their own kind of mystery series and other series that they write. So
Thank you, Jennifer. I do want to discuss a bit more about the revisions to the original text. We talked about the new adaptations, but what about the original revisions of the text?
well, the original, what they kind of did was, it was Grosset really that drove the revising, because by the mid 50s, they were changing the books to 20 chapters instead of 25, which they had been 25 chapters. So book number 35 came out with 20 chapters, and they decided they wanted to revise the first 34, shorten them. Some of it was attention span, but the main reason was it was cheaper to produce a 20 chapter book, number one. And some of the old printing plates were starting to wear out. So as printing plates would be kind of wearing out, they would then revise that book. So they weren't all revised in the same order. Like the first several came out at the beginning, and then it was this haphazard order it's like a nearly 20-year process that they were published as revised versions. What they were able to do in the revising process is remove stereotypes and prejudices and, you know, outdated language like electric lights, because it wasn't anything fancy schmancy anymore by the time they were revising them. You know, everybody had most people had electricity. So they would take, and slang and things like that would be updated. But the main reason they revised those books was economic. And that's kind of detailed in the business records at the New York Public Library. So we kind of learn about that there.
I wonder too, we were talking really specifically about Carolyn Keane earlier. Someone in the QA asked if we could talk about the illustrations. I have one behind me, and even the covers are intriguing. They really pull you in a lot of cases and make you want to read them. So if any of you could maybe speak to some of the illustrations that have been used throughout the series.
Well, I think one of my favorite illustrators was the first illustrator, Russell Tandy. I mean, I think his sophisticated portrayal of Nancy Drew certainly added to her popularity. And I mean, there's some series that had these just kind of, they're okay covers, but there was something so sophisticated and beautiful about his paintings. I mean, there's one in the Toledo Library that's in the mystery room with my collection now. That's the only way I'll ever own a Tandy. It's in the collection room in my collection. They're not, I mean, I can kind of, let me see if I can flip this. Can I flip it? Or maybe I can just turn it this way. But I can kind of like show, let's see, one of these covers for my books, like right here. I don't know if we're getting a good, maybe if I turn it this way, you can kind of see how just beautiful and sophisticated she is. This is one of the later Tandy ones, but Old Attic is really iconic. Where she's in the spooky old attic and there's the little skeleton peeking out of the wardrobe. I mean, this one recently sold at auction a couple years ago to one of our Nancy Drew collectors. And it's beautiful. It's one of my favorite Tandy covers. So yeah, so Tandy was very, you know, sophisticated, and Bill Gillies did a few covers in the 50s. And then we had Rudy Nappy, who did the most covers for the classic series, and those are still, you know, in print, with the exception of a couple of Bill Gillies covers. But I think they're so evocative of, you know, Nancy. She's so sophisticated looking, or there's something mysterious about the way they were drawn. And, you know, people judge a book by its cover to a degree. And I think probably the books I remember liking the most are the ones that I like the covers the most. I'm guilty of doing that. But yeah, so I don't know. What about you, Julie? Which covers did you prefer growing up?
I love Tandy's too. I think the work was just incredible. And as you said, that they, you know, just lent itself to the whole, the mystery and the excitement and the thrill of a Nancy Drew mystery story. So I think that they did a fabulous job with those illustrations, particularly earlier on. So I agree.
And Dr. Down, at the top of the program, you mentioned kind of finding the books in a desk at school. Did the covers do anything to pull you in? Did the artwork have any meaning for you?
Yeah, I think having a good cover is important for, you getting to pick up and read the book. But I also think for me, it's important sometimes to have the book cover, especially Nancy Drew, match if you're reading what you have in your mind that she looks like. I find this with other books sometimes. If you're reading like a book and you really don't think that the cover looks like anything like the way you would envision the person, for some reason it takes something away from reading the book for me. So I think it really is important to, like, this is the way that you would envision Nancy looking from the way she's described in the book.
Yeah, I think especially Abby and I as librarians, we're kind of touting all the time that, don't judge a book by its cover, but I think we definitely do. An appealing cover will pull you in no matter what. Just keeping an eye on time, and I want to make sure we have some time for some of the great questions that we have in the Q&A. In terms of modern day relevance, and Dr. Down, if you wanted to start with this, I'm going to combine some questions here. I guess how is Nancy Drew relevant to the modern world? How have her stories persisted after 90 years?
Well, I think from a popular culture perspective, Nancy Drew is like a popular culture icon. And I think it's interesting because she's been like in all different media, print, television, movies, videos, and even like zines where people express their own feelings about Nancy Drew. So to me, that makes it her iconic because she just cuts across our culture, and whatever kind of new media comes out, then, once you have movies, there you have Nancy Drew. Once you have television, then you have Nancy Drew. Video games, Nancy Drew. Whatever there might be in the future, I'm sure there'll be Nancy Drew there. So I think the importance is that there's something about her that, speaks to our culture, our popular culture, and she's just become part of it. I always think a person is really a popular culture icon when they have their own cookbook. So you have Nancy Drew cookbook. So.
Jennifer, Julia, how about you in terms of how she's relevant to today's world and why she's persisted this long?
Well, I think you think back to 90 years ago. I mean, we just recently celebrated, this is the 100th year of women's having the right to, obtaining the right to vote. So years previously, women finally were allowed to vote and to think about, again, what was happening in our country, in the world in 1930. And even though there were a significant series in books featuring independent female sleuths, Nancy Drew, I maintained from where we started the program that, her independence, her spunkiness, her feistiness, her resourcefulness, her not wanting to really rely on anyone to solve this mystery, to resolve the situation, still is very relevant to kids, boys and girls. So I think that's why Nancy Drew has stood the test of time, as well as the fact that generations it's been so heartwarming to be at a bookstore signing copies of the biography and having the bookstore wisely setting aside Nancy Drew mystery stories to bundle up and have grandma or mom buy for that next generation of readers. So I think it's that she's so iconic and she's so beloved by generations that we want to pass that love on to younger readers and hopefully introduce them to the originals, or even if it's updated versions, they're still coming to know and to love Nancy Drew, as we all do.
Yeah, I kind of concur with everything you guys just said. I mean, even though it's not 1930 and it's 10 years after women got the right to vote and Nancy Drew is this breakout character that women were waiting for, here we are, it's, 2020, and women have had all of these things for so many years. So she's not such a breakout, but the group that's reading these books, that 8 to 12 set, they're still so idealistic. They're still forming and shaping their, you know, views and ideas. And so I think that no matter what time period you're reading these books, it's relevant because you're seeing this character that motivates you, that's inspiring, that's helping others, that's righting wrongs and having fun adventures, and it's motivating you to want to do more. So I think that still is always why these books are so relevant today, even though it's not 1930 and it's 2020. And for adults today, I think it's nostalgia, you know, getting to go back and revisit happy childhood, if you had a happy childhood, or something about Nancy that was pleasant for you as a child. And it's escaping from all the craziness, you know, that's going on right now, and finding a happy place. So whether you're a kid or an adult, Nancy's got something for everybody.
Speaking to, I mean, the craziness that's going on now with the pandemic and you know, the past craziness that you know, Nancy Drew has seen over the 90 years. You know, we talked about how she's a role model. You know, what about some of the things that complicate the character? You know, and maybe elements that have existed maybe in the past or over the series, maybe elements of racism or classism or subjugation of her character. And I'll let any of you respond to that.
I have to say that I find it, like when I'm looking back reading Nancy Drew now at my age, a bit problematic to read Nancy Drew. First of all, the original series were written during the 30s, but there's no hint at all of the Depression. Nancy Drew is a very privileged white woman, you know, who's got money to do anything that she wants to do. And I know some of that is part of the story and it's like a fantasy, but it is kind of hard. You know, there's problematic things about Nancy Drew too, I think, with race, that she sort of, is she feminist or is she not feminist, or feminist in one period of time? But she's sort of like the, you know, the white woman who comes in and saves everybody. And I find that a little bit problematic too. And I think in the original series, just how Blacks and ethnic groups were portrayed and how they were usually the person who had something to do with the crime or fell under suspicion. And so I'm not saying that I still don't like Nancy Drew, but when I read now through a different lens of having lived my life longer than when I first read her, I do find a lot of problematic things that make me think about the Nancy Drew character.
Sure. Yeah, and I think that, I mean, that's happening in society now with lots of cultural icons that have existed over time. Jennifer and Julie, do you have anything to add to that?
You know, I mean, yeah, it's unfortunate. I kind of look at it as a product of its time, you know, and that's the way it was back then. And we can't change the past, but we've clearly changed the future. So that's, you know, it's all about learning and a process. And I feel good in the direction it's going today. Those books aren't even in print anymore. You know, they were revised. So like for decades they haven't. I mean, you can still go find an original at an antique store on eBay. But yeah, I kind of view it through that lens. And, you know, the stereotypes were such a small percentage of the overall book. I try to just focus on the good story writing and the mystery itself and the characters, and, you know, kind of compartmentalize it, I guess. When I reread these books, I can kind of do that. I like rationalize it that way. I know it's hard for some people to do that. Sure. So it's probably my logical, lawyerly mind. I can just compartmentalize everything, you know, but yeah. But I agree with what Doctor said, yeah.
All right, great. We have just a few minutes left. Abby, is there any questions from the Q&A that you wanted to make sure we get to?
There's a few about the oldest known Nancy Drew book, so I'm sure that'll be a quick one. What is the oldest Nancy Drew book? Panel of experts.
Well, book number 1, or actually the first 3 came out the same day, so they're all the same age.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, I should say the titles in case anybody is not sure. It's Secret of the Old Clock, The Hidden Staircase, and The Bungalow Mystery. Those are the 3 oldest.
Perfect. And what year were those published, Jennifer?
1930.
Perfect.
And Millie wrote all 3 of those, and The Hidden Staircase, she said, was her favorite of the Nancy Drew mystery.
Thank you, Julie. And then kind of in a similar vein, what's usually the auction value of first editions? And have you ever found one in a place other than an auction, like at an antique store? That might be one for you, Jennifer.
Yeah, so a couple of things. I put together the collection I donated to Toledo Library, mostly using eBay. Funny, 90% of that I was able to get on eBay back in the heyday when so much was on there. But originally, I was in an antique store when I found a hidden staircase from the 1930s. And that sort of spurned my zeal to collect these books and learn about the history and get, interested in all that aspect. So yeah, it's fun to be out in the quote wild, as we call it, and find the books at bookstores or antique stores and things like that. But I still love going on eBay and trying to find something elusive that I don't have.
Yeah, there's a whole science Jen helped me learn as far as, when the books were actually originally came out, as well as reprints, to look into those, first couple of pages to see if they're referencing other titles in the series. And if so, then it's not an original. And typically you'll find a print date on them. And again, the first 3 came out in 1930. So if you have any other version other than 1930, then it was a reprint, one of the originals per se.
Oh yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because the copyright date's kind of like a red herring. So just because it says 1930, it could be a 1950s printing. So like Julie said, if it has a dust jacket, look at the list of Nancy Drews, or if it doesn't, look inside in the beginning or at the end and see what the last Nancy Drew book is that's listed and look up when that was published. And it's not an exact science because sometimes they would fail to update a list, but most of the time they did. So you can kind of pinpoint within a year or so of when that book might have been printed.
I think people often find that they do have copies that they don't even know about. Like we often get donations when people's parents or grandparents die, that they've just been in the attic or something and they have just forgotten about them. But I think sometimes because they're thought of as children's books, that a lot of people don't think of them as collectibles, and so they've had them, but they've never thought about them.
Real quick, we have one more minute. And there's a great question, I think, in the Q&A, and maybe Dr. Down, if you may be able to address this, or maybe you or I, Abby, to some extent. Why were librarians critical of the series, and what, in quotes, literature was it being compared to?
Yeah, I think the librarians were critical because they didn't consider it like good literature, and that it wasn't educational type of literature. And so the children wouldn't learn how to read and have the proper language, and it would be, I don't know, like comics and that would lead to lots of bad behavior and everything. So I don't know. Yeah.
I'll add, as a representative of the library, and I think Abby can attest to it too, is those opinions are hopefully in the past. We try to be objective as possible in terms of offering reading options to anyone who comes in. And like you said, with comics too, I do quite a bit of work with comics in libraries, and there's a whole history there with Frederick Wertham and Seduction of the Innocent and the Comics Code Authority, and I think Nancy Drew kind of falls into that catch-all of pulp and science fiction and mystery that isn't always approved by gatekeepers. So,
but as we know, and through the work that we do with Claire's Day, it's all about turning kids on to read.
Absolutely.
Comic book, it's a graphic novel, it's Nancy Drew, it's Hardy Boys, it's it's just find whatever you can to ignite that passion for reading with a child, and just let them go, and then ultimately they'll find things that perhaps are a little, I don't know, but let them read Nancy Drews and Hardy Boys.
And that's what it's all about. That's why we're here 90 years after the fact, because we read these books and fell in love with them. So
yeah,
right, well,
I was just going to say, I love that in the collection room, you guys have like circulation books on top of the cases that say, check me out, because that kind of gets them inspired to keep reading them. So that's really neat.
Yeah. And I'll add too, Jennifer's collection is at the main library, and please visit if you haven't. There's a fantastic mystery wall there where you can kind of solve the Nancy Drew mystery and play a little game too. So it's a great time, and we've kind of embraced those local connections that Nancy Drew has.